You're listening to Always Player One, a solo board gaming podcast.
Hello and welcome to Always Player One. I'm Scruffy.
And I'm Norm, and today we're going to be talking about Blades in the Dark, the non-solo tabletop role-playing game. But don't run away just yet, because what we're hoping to talk about today is how we've converted this multiplayer tabletop role-playing game into a solo experience ourselves. Isn't that right, Scruffy?
That's right. This is very much a first for Always Player One, where we are looking at a multiplayer game which we've taken on the ambitious task of attempting to convert to being a solo game, because we like a challenge.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was off the back of the episode where we spoke about Scarlet Heroes with Deborah from Geek Gamers. Deborah was talking to us about the different resources you can use to roleplay any game solo, and it was amazing to us in that interview that she said in many ways the actual rules, the rule set, can be the last thing you consider, you know, when you're making a solo experience. And she was talking as if there was a practice, something you can practice, you know, being your own GM. And we thought, why don't we try that with a non-solo role-playing game and talk about what we've learned and put into practice and just compare our experiences and how we got on.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll also be bringing in to the episode a look at Alone in the Dark, which is actually a solo supplement. I think it's a fan-made solo supplement by Peter Burgess, which gave us a bit of a boost start for the game, but it's, as we'll mention in the episode, it's not a complete system, I wouldn't say, on its own. It's just sort of a helper for Blades in the Dark specifically. And I also looked at Mythic, the GM emulator, and I want to talk about how much that helped or didn't help and whether I ended up using it or not in the show.
Perfect. But before we do, there's a little bit we want to take care of, a couple of announcements we want to make. The first one is in relation to the format of the show. So if you've been listening to us, then you'll know that we have changed the release schedule recently. We've moved from a 2-weekly podcast to a 4-weekly podcast. Now, we said this would be temporary, and we meant it, because the next episode of Always Player One will be out in 2 weeks. But yeah, I'm excited to be back on a 2-week format.
Yeah, it's awesome, and it's really awesome to have you back, Norm. I can't wait for what we end up covering in 2 weeks' time and everything else we've got going on. And on that topic, we had our Twitch live stream of Marvel Champions recently. Thank you to everyone who could make it along to join us for that. It was really a lot of fun, even though we had a lot of trouble with the villains in that game. So yeah, how did you find that, Norm?
I found the Twitch stream really fun. I know we didn't have the best luck in the world when we played Marvel Champions, but it was neat. It's always fun to get on live stream with our listeners, and it's always fun to play games that we're really passionate about and give you a little inside scoop as to how we play.
And we have more Twitch streams planned for the future.
Yes, absolutely. So although with all the changes going on and now things are going back to normal, you're probably wondering what's going to happen with the Twitch streams. As Scruffy said, we're going to keep them going because we enjoyed them.
Exactly. So keep an eye on the Discord for when those are happening. Keep your eyes open. Moving on then. So let's get started on today's show. We, like Norm said, are talking about Blades in the Dark, a non-solo RPG which we've tried to make solo. So I'll dive right in to give you a bit of an overview of what Blades is for anyone who's not heard of it before. So Blades in the Dark is an RPG system set in a dark and supernatural city named Duskvol. As players, you take on the role of gang members attempting to make a name for yourselves and your crew in the city. The game asks you to buy into the idea of taking risks, overreaching, and getting into a lot of trouble, with the focus on action rather than planning. That said, there is scope for much more than just combat in this game, and the type of gang or character you choose to play can see you dealing in subterfuge, politics, social interactions, dealing with spirits, and anything else you want to tackle. The game breaks down into 3 phases: setup, the score, and then downtime. During the setup, you establish what score you'll be doing, and it is encouraged to not focus in very much detail on interactions at this point in the game, keeping things loose, skipping around in time, maybe with just one or two quick scenes establishing key contacts and exposition. After this, you will choose an approach for how you want to start your score, and then roll an engagement roll to see if you start in a controlled, risky, or desperate situation. Then the main score happens. This is the bulk of the game where scenes play out in much more detail and often move linearly. Players are allowed to bring flashbacks up during scenes if they want to introduce things they think it is likely their character would have already set up. After the score is done, whether a success or a failure, the players move into downtime where they get paid, advance their characters and gang, deal with other factions in the city, and finally get a chance to take a few actions to recover their character and work on any long term goals. It is very possible in this game to die, get traumatized, get arrested, and all manner of other problems. And these consequences often lead to more stories rather than just being an end to the adventure. As we've said, we also experienced the Blades in the Dark solo supplement, which offers a few additional rules for solo play, including a very interesting picture oracle, which I'm very keen to talk about with you guys today. Is there anything you'd like to add about Blades for people who haven't experienced the game before, Norm?
If I can do some more scene setting, to understand Duskfall and what it's like as a setting, picture Peaky Blinders, but it's eternally dark because the sun has exploded. And the world is full of ghosts and demons. And you've got something that looks like Duskfall.
Yeah, yeah. The world building in this game is amazing. When you pitched it to me like that when we first played our multiplayer version of the game, I had to go away and look it up. The sun's exploded. How is it not a block of ice and all this? But when you read deeper, you see it's actually shattered into pieces, and there's like 3 hours a day and 3 hours at night where they get dim sunlight kind of coming through the fog of the city. And so things can still grow, but I imagine all the sort of plants and the wildlife are a little bit subdued, a little bit twisted and gnarled. It's very evocative and fun, and it really does paint a scene because everything you end up doing really is kind of in the dark. You are walking around at night in this kind of cobblestone city with lamp lights powered by Titan's blood rather than electricity in this world. It's very supernatural, very spooky, and a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So why did we choose this one for solo play? What drew us to Blades in the Dark in the first place? So I really want to start the conversation by just talking about why people should care about Blades in the Dark in the first place and what it does as a system before we move on to the solo specific stuff. Is that okay with you, Scruffy?
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, if you don't end up being sold on the system from what we say, don't worry, because during the episode, I think a lot of what we say should hopefully allow you to take whatever systems you are passionate about and maybe give you some tools or some inspiration to work out how to make those soloable for yourself. But Blades is definitely worth your attention.
Why is that, Scruffy? What about the game do you? Because we before we played solo, we played in the campaign together with myself as a GM, and then you and three other players. Was it? I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What is it about Blades that speaks to you and gets you coming back for more?
So I didn't expect it to be quite so evocative and such good shorthand. I think one of the strengths for a system or for a world for anything like that in RP is that it makes your imaginative job easier. That you don't have to reach for things. You've got all this kind of schema to pull back on of inspiration that you can easily latch onto. It's why I think Dungeons and Dragons is so popular because we all know high fantasy. We've all seen Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or whatever, and we can connect those things over. We know what an elf is, we know what a dwarf is. That image pops into our brain very quickly. And I thought that would be a barrier to entry for Blades for me, but I was really surprised to find that really it came so naturally. As soon as I started doing funny voices for the characters and talking in an old London accent or something, they popped. They were vivid. I knew them. I recognized them. The NPCs, all my character. My character for our multiplayer campaign, for example, is the most vivid character I've ever made for me for an RP, and it didn't take very much work at all.
Yeah, and it doesn't take much work in terms of finding the character, but also in terms of just creating them, because the character
Mm.
creation process in Blades in the Dark is really nothing. So it's a powered by the Apocalypse game. So there are you're first asked to choose a what's called a playbook, and a playbook is basically like a blueprint for your character's archetype. So you pick it, and it will have special abilities already selected. It will have some attributes already filled in, and it will give you an idea of what you're good at and what you're not good at already. And then it will ask you interesting questions, like to talk about your background, to talk about your heritage, to talk about where you come from. And it's in asking these really sort of insightful questions that means in 10 minutes you can come up with a pretty unique character. For specifically me, because I only GM'd multiplayer. So when I started playing solo, it was the first time I played as a player. And I thought, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make the most two-dimensional character I possibly can, just so I can get started really quickly and see what I run into and how it plays solo. The game kept making me make them three-dimensional. I was like, not now, game. I want to just... I don't want this character to be interesting, but they are, and I really like playing them now. And I'm probably going to keep playing that little solo campaign even after the show, which is it speaks volumes of how wonderful it is at that, and that's just in the character creation.
Yeah, and it's important to say there that that doesn't happen through a lot of labor. Like,
Yeah.
you sticking to trying to make it two-dimensional, the reason it made it difficult was because it asks you very broad questions, but not very many of them, and they hit home. So I'll give you some examples. So obviously, it asks for your heritage, where you come from in the world. Were you born in the city, or were you born in one of the other countries? That's interesting. And then it asks your background. So where did you work before? Did you come from the underworld? Did you come from a labor job? Were you working in law, in a trade, in the military? Were you a former noble? That's one word, and it paints a real picture. And then my personal favorite question it asks you is, what is your vice? What is your character's thing they do for fun? And I really think more systems need to do that. And it's really well done in Blades, obviously, because all of the vices are kind of a bit seedy and sordid. You have people who have a vice for gambling, or for pleasure, for stupor. Some of them are a bit more wholesome, like maybe an obligation, like family or something. One of them's just called weird. But within those categories, those broad categories, you can then specify what specifically your character's interested in. Is there stupor alcohol? Is there where do they gamble? There's all sorts of places that you can pick in the city where you can say they gamble. But that's stuff you have the option of diving into, and you'll probably do during a downtime when you've finished your score. It's stuff that you kind of unravel about your character as you get to know them more. The first choice, though, what do they do? It's a lovely choice, and it really paints a picture and in really broad strokes, but it gives you those kind of instant things to reach for your character.
And of course, whilst you're making your character, you're also making a crew.
Hmm.
So it's like a separate character sheet where you have to build a crew. Just, what are they? What kind of jobs do they do? And it asks similar questions. And it really helps you connect the dots when you're thinking, okay, well, they have this kind of vice, and they come from this kind of background, and they're in this kind of crew. I have a really good understanding of who they are as a person and what they care about. And like you say, Scruffy, that is with very little effort, because most of the work is done when you select the playbook, which to some people they would say, oh, don't give me a playbook. I want to make my character from scratch. And
Well, I mean, you can do that. There is an option to make your own playbook.
yeah, but to me, I'm just, yeah, I really appreciate how easy it is.
Yeah, these playbooks, they don't. The great thing about them, I think, is they avoid a lot of the mistakes I think a lot of the Powered by the Apocalypse games make. And I'm not going to trash talk any specific systems here, but the problem I think they make is they are such a specific cookie cutter that they kind of fill in a lot of your character details, which I don't think the playbooks in Blades really does. So, give you some examples of playbooks. Your character might be a cutter, or a hound, or a spider. They're very evocative things, and they're just like one or two words to say sort of what their vocation is more than anything. But you could have a cutter who has a completely different personality to mine. You could have your spider could be really subtle and soft. my spider might be a completely different sort of spider. It doesn't say anything about their personality, more what they do. It's not who they are, it's what they do. And I think that's an important distinction that the playbooks offer in Blades.
And I think it really quite a remarkable achievement that these playbooks and characters do feel unique when all of the archetypes are a different version of a scoundrel. You're all scoundrels.
Yeah.
You know, you're all scoundrels. It's almost like they've gone, imagine D&D, but you're all rogues, but they're a very different, distinct archetype of rogues in this game.
See, that's funny. I see it as you're all the bandits, the thugs that you come across as your D&D adventures come across and tackle for their first fight. You know,
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
especially in my solo game, I keep having these moments where I stop and go, "Are we the bad guys?"
If you're not the bad guys, then you're playing the game wrong. Because,
Yeah. So
yeah,
I think you have to be willing to be the bad guys and be doing very morally dubious and unscrupulous things, but in a city that is corrupt to its core. You know,
mhm.
it's run by corrupt cops and demons and all sorts of horrible things. So you're just trying to do the best you can.
Yeah. The only good people in Duskfall are the people who are manipulated by folks such as yourself when you're playing. And who wants to play a character like that?
I think that's a pretty good description of why we both love Blades. Can we talk about the actual gameplay and
Yes.
how it functions, how a kind of the mechanics work in the rubric of Blades? To borrow Deborah's word there, we'll be throwing out generative, suggestive, restrictive, and rubric a lot in this episode. I imagine if you
Oh
haven't
yes.
listened to our Scarlet Heroes episode, I'd definitely recommend that to get a kind of overview of those words. So, I guess the kind of the first place to start with this is that every role in the game is it's kind of a negotiation between you and the GM. You kind of say, well, here's what I want to do. I want to climb that fence. I want to intimidate that barkeeper, whatever it is. And then you choose the relevant attribute which you think best describes the way you're doing that. And obviously in multiplayer, then the GM will come back to you and say, okay, they never are allowed to say you have to do it a different way. You're the player, you decide the way you're doing things. They'll say, okay, this would be a controlled situation, a risky situation, or a desperate situation, depending on the context of what's happening.
And it will have either a greater effect, a regular effect, or
Limited effect.
limited effect. And I think it might even be standard effect, not regular. But yeah, so there's a conversation. It's a conversation between the player and the GM.
And for all you real technical minded people, then what you do is you roll d6 dice equal to how many dots you have in that skill. And the way it always works is if you roll 2 sixes, you get a critical hit. 1 6, you do it. 4 or 5 is kind of a mixed result, and the specifics depends on whether you had a risky, desperate, or controlled situation with bigger consequences happening if you're in a desperate situation than if you're in a controlled one, and risky being standard. And finally, a 1 to a 3 being the highest roll would be no success, basically. You just have a consequence happen instead. And those consequences can vary greatly, and it will depend a lot on the context. And as I've just mentioned, based on the type of situation you're in.
That's really interesting as well, because you're probably thinking from a solo point of view, well, if the GM needs to be involved so much, then how does that lend itself to solo? Why do you even bother? How do you handle that? But I actually found that this part was one of the easiest parts to convert to solo. And the reason being is because all the roles in this game are player facing as well. The GM never rolls for any NPCs. It's similar to Iron Sworn in that the players always roll. Even if the NPCs are acting, you would roll to dodge. You wouldn't roll to see how well they hit, for example. So that's one reason why it works quite well solo. But the other reason is that by having it as an open conversation between the player and the GM, when we play multiplayer, I often found that as the GM, the players would question me. They'll say, well, are you sure it's desperate? I actually think that because I've done this, that it's only risky and not desperate. Is there any leeway? And I could either say yes or no, and that's my prerogative as a GM. But what's interesting is because it's all out in the open, the players can figure it out and figure out what they think and correctly assert what they think the position is. Is it risky? Is it desperate? Or is it controlled? And because it's all open information like that, converting that to solo and just making both those decisions as both the player and the GM, it was actually super easy. I didn't miss having a GM there at all when it came to positioning the role and the moves that you take in the game. I don't know what you thought about that, Scruffy.
Yeah, because it's all about the GM's role in that is policing, isn't it? It's to try and make sure it stays fair. And I think it just takes a very kind of mature attitude to police yourself and know that you're being fair with yourself. And I found it a bit tricky at first because I realized after my first few games that I was probably being a bit too harsh for myself. And I think that's the way I was tilting. But you do find eventually a kind of a middle balance where it is fair and it feels fair, and it only has to feel fair to you, and there's no bad feelings about that, you know. And it is kind of a fine art of getting it just right, and the more you play, the more it makes sense and it feels sensible. And yeah, you're right, for solo play, everything being player facing, and it just means you're cutting out a conversation there. It just speeds it up. It makes it even quicker than it already was.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It just means that there isn't that, because oftentimes as a GM, you say it's risky and standard, and everyone goes, okay, GM, fine, and
Yeah,
rolls. But it's
yeah.
only occasionally where there's, there may be 2 or 3 times in the sessions that we played where there was any kind of disagreement. So I might as well have not been there for those positionings. You could have done that yourself.
And the interesting thing here is that it's a very interesting choice from the player's perspective, because you're often trying to work out how to get one more dice, maybe. And we'll just come on to how the system lets you have some sneaky bonus dice in a moment. But because they are very limited, you're rolling one dice, sometimes zero dice. So that's where, in that case, you have to roll 2d6 and take the worst one. Sometimes 2 dice, or if you're really, really good at something, 3 dice. Wow, it's a lot of dice to be rolling. And that's a kind of a thing you're trying to eke out as the player, and you're all trying to play to your strengths, which makes sense. It's thematically similar to what your character's doing. They're sat there thinking, how can I solve this with the thing I'm good at? People lean on their strengths. That's what you do. If you're better at talking than fighting in the real world, you'll try and resolve conflicts by talking. I mean, that's what I do. And the game really encourages you to try and take it a step further and make trouble for yourself. And the way it does that is twofold. One, the bonus dice, and two, it rewards you for playing desperate situations.
Yes.
So, I mean, that one explains itself. Anytime you do anything in a desperate situation, you get a mark a little bit of XP for your skills. So you're always trying to, if you find a desperate situation, you're not scared of doing it. You're not trying to meta game and avoid desperate situations. As a player, you're kind of like, yeah, I'll do it. Why not? I get a tick. But the bonus dice, that's one of my favorite things about the game. And you can get a bonus dice in one of two ways. You can either push yourself, which just means taking 2 stress. And if you get 10 stress in a session, which you cannot heal during the score at all, you are traumatized and have a permanent affliction for your character. So you can see how early on you might be a bit blasé taking those extra dice, but as the score wears on you, it gets a little bit harder to justify it. And you get to a point where you go, I can't take stress now, I'll be traumatized. And that 1 dice becomes an unobtainable bonus. Or there's devil's bargains.
Yes, and Devil's Bargains, the way they work in multiplayer is the GM will say to their players, you can take a bonus die, but there's going to be a complication. Now, the players agree to the complication before they take their dice. So, despite the roll, you could fail the roll, but you still have to take the complication. You got the complication for taking the die, not for the guaranteed result, which I think is lovely, first of all.
Yes.
But second of all, so again, to convert that from multiplayer to solo, you must be thinking, well, this surely can't be solo. What kind of trickery did Scruffy and Norm do to overcome this? Again, when you play it multiplayer, oftentimes people would say to me as a player, Norm, can I have a devil's bargain? And I'd say, oh, I can't think of anything, sorry. And they go, oh, I've got a good one. and they'd come up with their own anyway. so,
Yeah.
so I found in solo again, I didn't really have to do any work to replace that element. If I thought of something that would be, interesting story wise and would give me a bonus, like you said, Scruffy, those bonus dice are golden. They're what you need as a player. So you're quite happy to take the complication. And I think that's just, yeah, it was really easy to convert to solo. I don't know what you thought of it or how often you used it in your games.
Yeah, I did. I mean, the thing is, you don't have to have a bonus devil's bargain for every roll. In fact, it feels like it should be rare that it comes up.
Yes.
It kind of feels like it should be an extra treat. There's a reward for being creative in the situation. And when we say a complication in this, that is basically the enemy's role in the game, right? That is them getting a hit, right?
Yeah.
Because they don't ever roll. Complications are how harm happens to you. They're how any sort of threat is introduced or empowered, or the way you lose, like a victory point to the enemy, however you want to look at it. And they can be diverse. And I think it's worth saying here that this is one of the first concrete things that both of us, I think, implemented when we started playing. Was we both set up an oracle for the complication, because the game says that the GM chooses the complication. And there were a few times where I just chose the thing that made the most sense. Like, I'm having a direct dual fight with someone. In this situation, if I get a complication, they're going to hit me back, right? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. I'm never going to get hurt or lose this fight, right? So in those cases, it makes sense. But most of the time, whenever you get a complication, I rolled on a little oracle I made for it, for all the different things that could happen, all the different bad things that could happen. And I found that really just, who needs GMs? That did it. That introduced sort of randomness. It made me have these random moments happen where I'd try and do a crazy stunt and roll a complication. I get a mixed effect. I do it, but a complication happens, and then I roll to see what that was. And oh, who knew? A new threat appears.
Yeah, and I did exactly the same thing. And this is like independently that we were doing this, and we sort of came together and said, yeah, that was like one of the first things I did as well. Is it's so important, this idea of introducing complications, because, like you said, Scruffy, is how the NPCs get to negatively affect you, or even how the world gets to negatively affect you. So to have that was really, really important. And if you're wondering how we did that, it's a simple case of, well, you could do it with any piece of paper, but available for free on the Ironsworn website, you can print off a bunch of blank oracles. And what's interesting about those oracles on there is they have different tables of different likelihoods, so you can really make your own and go nuts. And I kept it very simple, and I think you did as well, Scruffy. But yeah, I kind of used my experience as a GM for the game to, what are the most common things that you want to introduce as a complication, and I kept them deliberately vague so that when it happened in the game, it would always kind of make sense in the context. And I had a lot of fun using those homemade oracles, and I was a little bit nervous to introduce them at first. I made them as one of the first things. I was kind of a little bit nervous to be like, this is something that I've made. I know that I've made this. Like, I don't know. I kind of felt silly, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I made my own little makeshift house rules for a few different things, and I think just the nature of the way that I tackled this was I cherry picked a lot of things. So I said about bringing in Mythic. I only took basically one system from the Mythic system into my game, but it really helped and it really fit in there. Which was when you set up a scene, you roll to see if it's interrupted or altered in any way. I also used their chaos rank and their oracles for tracking the likelihood of whether things succeed or fail, and I had kind of mixed opinions about that. But yeah, I think when you make your own personal systems, it can feel a bit like, well, what if I've got it wrong? What if I
Hmm.
haven't thought of something? What if I'm missing something really important? But I think it's really, once you do it and you start having success with it, you realize, wait, if I'm realizing I'm missing something from my game, I can just add that in.
Yes. Yeah, I can just add that in. And also, people get things wrong in role playing games all the time. This stuff is normally left to be decided by a GM. And a GM is just a person.
Yeah.
They're just a person that you know that's in your game group. And
Mm.
if you played other games with them, you probably know that they're just as fallible as yourself. They make mistakes, they get things wrong, and they think of things on the fly that maybe if they had more time to think about, they would have done a better job later on. It's okay to lean on your own experience and be a GM for yourself in these
Yes.
cases.
Yeah, and I think empowering yourself in that way and giving yourself permission to make the decision is a very mature thing to do. And I think it's a really helped me personally with my games to just have a bit more confidence in my own judgment. I don't know if that's happened for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I'm saying this, I'm sort of sat here thinking, listeners at home must be thinking, right, so in this game, I have to wear two hats. I have to be the GM and I have to be the player. So it's different to, what I'm used to. It's different to Thousand-Year-Old Vampire, or it's different to Wretched, or it's different to Ironsworn, or kind of, but actually, in a lot of ways, Blades in the Dark gives you a lot of feedback in the same way a lot of these games already do. And I'd like to just unpack those for a moment because I want to make it crystal clear that there's a lot of times where Blades will prompt you to create something, and it's made for the GM. It prompts the GM openly in front of all the players, and in this case, you just have to make that decision as well. But it doesn't feel too dissimilar to like Ironsworn, for example. And I don't want to keep making a comparison, but it is the solo system I know the best. So when Scruffy's already described how the rolling works and how the resolution mechanic in Blades in the Dark works. But every time you roll it, you don't have to remember, all right, a 6 is a hit. Every time you roll, you check against a table, against the controlled table, against the risky table, or against the desperate table. And it will tell you what to introduce into the game. Okay, you succeed, but bring in player complication. And like we said, we made oracles, so that we made decisions. And that's not dissimilar to Ironsworn saying, yeah, you face danger, you succeed, but pay the price. Or, that's very similar. It's basically the same thing, right, Scruffy?
For me, I don't think it was. I think it was very different in that way. That's one part of the system where I would say Blades is a lot more predictable than Iron Swarm for me,
Yes.
because the actions are always the same. They're always resolved the same way. Whether you're drop kicking someone or whether you're sneaking past a guard, you will be rolling the dice, and a 6 is a hit, a 5 or a 4 or a 5 is a weak hit with varying degrees of complications attached to it, and a 1 to a 3 is a miss with varying degrees of complication. That's kind of the way, it's yes, it happens, yes, but no, or no, but.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the thing. In Ironsworn, however, each move is distinct and the results are slightly different. It gives you much more specific prompts on how to resolve this next. When you secure an advantage, that has a mechanical impact that's different to when you strike someone, for example.
No, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree that the prompts in Blades aren't as specific, but they are still prompts. There are role playing systems with no prompts at all. If I took D&D to play solo, there would be no prompt. If I rolled a 16, what does that mean? There's no table to check. Whereas in Blades, it at least exists. And I'm not trying to say it's as good, but I'm trying to say it's there to help you. It is there to help you, and it's there to help the GM. And in the same way, it's there to help you as a soloist, as the player GM.
Yeah, I think any system you pick to solo, you want to try and find one that gives the GM as many tools as possible, because you are taking on the role of the GM, aren't you? There's no getting around that. And you're responsible now for what the GM is responsible for. And I guess it's worth kind of just unpacking what that is in a game, because it's made me really realize what the GM, what their job is. And I feel like their job is two distinct things. They're in charge of exposition, and they're responsible for making decisions about conflicts and the results of any positive or negative effects to characters in those conflicts.
Can I just, before we dive in, because I feel like this is a big topic to bring up.
Yeah, okay.
Before we dive in, I just want to hone in on my point that I was trying to make, just so I'm as crystal clear as possible with regards to why I feel that the game holds your hand as a soloist in regards to the dice rolling, is because I didn't feel like when I was, although I was making up the complication, I didn't have the specific prompt that something like Ironsworn would. But the fact that a prompt exists meant that when I was asked to make something up, when I was asked to introduce complication, I was doing it because the game told me to. So I still felt like I was playing the game and not just making things up. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I think this is a really important kind of feeling that you need to unlock when you're trying to GM for yourself or play a solo. RP is, well, if I can just make it up, surely I'm allowed to do anything then. And where's the restrictions? Where are the rules to say no, you can't do that?
Or no, you can't do that, and things get harder.
Hmm. I think that does come a bit from policing yourself and not trying to game the system. But I think more than that, it comes from a lot of the times the rubric of the system. But yeah, I think once you feel like you are not cheating, then you've kind of got it, right? Like
Yes.
that's what you need to find. You need to find the, I don't know what the word is, the framework, the box within which to play.
Yeah, you need to feel like, okay, now I'm making something up now, but it's fine because this is how you play the game. This is what the game's asked me. I've reached a point in the game where my role in the game now is to make something up. And I think Blades does that quite well. From a GM's point of view, because obviously I GM'd our games, when I had to introduce things, when I had to introduce complications, I felt like I had license to do so. Because, oh, sorry, Scruffy, you rolled a 3, and it was a desperate. That means you're going to suffer a complication. Not just a consequence of your action, but a complication. So it could be anything. I can introduce whatever I want now. And I feel like the game has given me license to do so. And it's the same when you're the soloist. You feel like, okay, I'm introducing something now, but it's because the game's told me to. I rolled a 3. I have to do this. I'm not cheating myself, you know?
Yes. Yeah. And I think not planning ahead is really important in that. So just allowing yourself to be like, whatever you first think of doing as your character, that's just what you do. And you roll. Don't worry about the consequence because it might not come up. Then if it does come up, you are empowered to make decisions on that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, sorry to interrupt, Scruffy. You were saying you want to unpack the role of a
Yeah.
GM because this has made you philosophical about who is a GM? What
Well,
are
okay, I
they?
mean, this feeds into what we were just saying really well. So the two things are exposition and conflict, and they're kind of a metronome for each other. Conflict breeds exposition, exposition breeds conflict. That's what the kind of the metronome that the GM has to keep going throughout the whole game, right? You do things as your characters within the fiction that then lead to a conflict, and that conflict gets resolved, which leads to more exposition about the story, the world, what's going on in the fiction, right? Now, I can't believe it's taken this long to talk about the clocks in Blades, because that's where this kind of really gets tied together for me in the Blade system. The way every sort of long-term project, which is stuff to do with the world and the fiction, or conflict is resolved in this game is with clocks, right?
Yes.
So when you're fighting somebody in this game, you will make a clock to represent defeating them, and you'll fill it in when you do things that make progress towards defeating them, however you're doing it, whether it's with violence or with words. And then you might have clocks that appear as complications. Maybe somebody's, maybe you're trying to sneak into a place and somebody's raised the alarm. The reinforcements are coming. You start a clock and you tick it down as the time goes on. Different things can trigger the clocks to tick down, but once they get filled in, that's it. And the way they look, because I'm saying clocks, give you the visualization of it. You draw a circle, a clock face, and then you choose how many segments to make for the clock.
It's a pie chart, right?
Yeah, kind of like a Trivial Pursuit sections, and you can make it 2 sections, 4 sections, 6 sections, 8 sections, however many you want. Probably I've never done more than 8. And when you do something, you'll either shade in 1 box if it had a weak effect, 2 boxes for a standard effect, or 3 boxes for a great effect. And once it's filled in, whatever the clock was ticking down for happens. And that clock might simply start another clock, or it might resolve in something happening. You knock out that guard, the reinforcements arrive. Whatever it is, they have massive scope, and you use them for basically everything.
Yeah.
But I think that's where the conflict resolution and the fiction really tie together for me in Blades.
Yeah, and again, it goes exactly to what we were saying, Scruffy, in that the game prompts you when to fill them in. If you're taking an action that is working towards filling in a clock, be that, take out this guard or win this fight or disarm this person, or whatever that clock is. It's clocks are basically, like you said, Scruffy, any sort of complex action that you want to take.
Yeah, they're a conflict, aren't they? There's something that you are trying to achieve. It doesn't have to be like a literal conflict. It can be like, I'm trying to build a a gateway to the underworld.
Get bypass this locked door, whatever it is. You can. It depends on how complex you want to make it for yourself as as you're policing yourself, as you're GMing yourself in the game. And it's a really easy way to kind of make things fair, because again the game will tell you, okay, well, you did something with great effect, you can tick in all those boxes for this clock, that's fine. You can do that thing that you were working to achieve because you filled in the whole clock. You don't feel like you're just choosing it, you're actually working towards something, which I think is lovely. I was saying to you in my game, my solo game, I'm playing as a crew of assassins. We've got a really difficult task of trying to assassinate two gang leaders on a moving train. And we've come on as wait staff because it's a super posh train where people are given top class food, and they're all playing cards in the first carriage. And as I do things that work towards that goal, get me closer to their carriage, get me closer to them, I'm ticking up a clock, and the clock is just to have an opportunity to strike. Now, I don't know once I fill in those clocks if I'm going to be successful, because that's a separate move. I'm going to have to attack them. I'm going to have to skirmish or whatever action I want to do at the time that makes the fictional sense. But on top of that, I know that if I work towards this, I will get that opportunity, and it's not because I've made it up or I've just invented it for myself. It's because my character worked towards something, because I put a clock in, and it's a really nice way to just police things for yourself. But on top of that, they do a whole host of other things, and I think you're going to sort of unpack how they affect the wider world and stuff like that
Yes,
as
I
well.
absolutely want to go into that. But just to finish off your point there, it's exactly what I was saying, that these clocks represent conflict. The resolution of the clocks, it feeds exposition and feels earned. You wouldn't finish a clock and just be like, nothing happens then. Something happens, something specifically happens that you were working towards. Or the clock gets abandoned and it doesn't happen, and you have to feed some other fiction into the world to explain why that was lost and abandoned. Either way, this is the system, I think, that most fixes the GM problem, right? Where it takes into account both of those things. It allows for you to have a mechanic that resolves conflict, helps you resolve conflict, feeds exposition, and then is created by the exposition that comes from the resultant situations.
And I think specifically why it works solo, I've already sort of unpacked why it works solo, and that it helps you feel like you're still playing the game and not just making things up for yourself. But on top of that, I think the reason it works solo is because even in multiplayer games, I feel like the clocks are a really good way to demonstrate to the players how their actions are having an impact on the world.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel like when I was ticking up the clocks as your GM, Scruffy, that was me impacting the world. They all became off of your dice rolling.
Yeah.
They came over, and that dice rolling was because of a decision that you made in the game. And the decision you make is having an impact. Now, the fact that that is all player driven means that playing that solo, I was really pleasantly surprised at how simple that transition was for me.
Yeah, the focus of the players determines what clocks you have that are building, doesn't it? And there might be curveballs thrown when a complication happens that says, when you roll on the oracle, and this is what I say about it being kind of essential to have your own oracle for this, that says add a new clock, because then it feels like the world has more weight to it, or an oracle that says tick an irrelevant clock up, because then it's not always based on what the player's doing. But the fact that it mostly is based on what the players are doing, I think makes for a very much more interesting story. And the other stuff of adding new clocks and ticking up unrelated clocks, that's more realism. If you're into the realism side of RP, you could just focus on having clocks and only ticking the ones up that matter for you in the scene, in the situation, and it would make just as much sense, because I mean that's what happens in real life, isn't it? When you're actively doing something in your day, that's the thing you encounter and experience. It's very rare that you get a curveball of something else happening to you in that moment. You you go shopping to the shops, you pick up your shopping, you've done that clock. It's very unlikely that other stuff's going to happen. You're not going to suddenly go to the gym. You have to actively go out of your way to start that clock.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. But the fact that clocks can be used to, and are used to account for things that aren't happening in your current scene, I think is a beautiful piece of
Yeah, it's
design
quite
because
nice.
it really makes Duskfall feel like a very active environment to role play in. It feels like a breathing world where, rival gangs will have their own clocks. And once they tick up, maybe they've had enough of you encroaching on their turf or expanding exponentially like you have been. Maybe they will have something to say about that. Maybe they won't. Maybe when their clock ticks up, something else will happen. But the fact that it's there and it's going up and sometimes going down,
Hmm.
it's a really very simple way to for you as the soloist to feel like your character belongs to a larger picture. They are a small piece in a much bigger active puzzle, which is lovely.
Yeah, and the world sort of develops the more you play. So this usually resolves during downtime. I find that
Yeah,
what I did at the end of my games, and I look forward to this every time. It's really exciting. Is I would roll a fortune dice, which is kind of the game's inbuilt, I guess, yes or no oracle. You could call it. And what you do is you just roll a d6 to see how much something happens or doesn't happen. It's 6 is a yes, 5 or 6 sort of happens, 1, 2, or 3 limited. No, no, it doesn't happen. And what I'd do is I'd have different clocks for the different factions to represent maybe their long-term goals, things they're doing that relate to me, or things that are totally unrelated to me. And I just roll for each of them to see how that ticks on, whether it ticks backwards, ticks forwards, and see how the rest of the world's breathing. And as a result of my score, I will end up adding a whole bunch more clocks for factions that I've come across in that score that I'm now interested in.
because you
And
inevitably annoyed them.
yeah, well, annoyed them or befriended them. I had one,
You can
for
befriend
example.
people in this game. Hold
Yeah,
on, no.
for sure. I had one sort of conflict, for example, to illustrate this between the lamp blacks and the red sashes, and they're at war with each other, and they were asking me to choose a side, which I did, and now I'm invested in that war. So I have two clocks for each of them to say, this one ticks up, they succeed. This one ticks up, the other team succeed, or you can make it a conflict one where they both start on 50-50 and rub them out if one loses for them and if the other loses, for example.
Which is a really nice tug of war, I think.
Yeah, it's a really lovely tug of war, and I was really interested in that. The first role I had for it, my guys really won. They got the best result they could, so I ticked it up 3 times in their favor, and it really framed that conflict interestingly for me. You know, they struck a big blow there, and who knows, maybe one more of those, and that will be the end of that conflict for now. And they'll have to come up with story around that. But it's exciting, it's interesting and immersive.
And because it's going on in the back of your mind, that is sort of, fodder that you can just chuck out when you need an unexpected consequence or when you need an ex machina to appear that's going to either throw your game or save your game. Maybe it's somebody who is upset as a result of that devastating blow. These things can it becomes self-referencing, which is lovely.
Yeah, I can quite see myself taking clocks into any other RP game I play because I love it. I really enjoy doing them, even just if I want to keep them for the long term story threads. And one thing I really like about it, it's worth saying as well, is they took me away from the computer. So I still, when I play, like writing my story down on the computer, but the clocks, I do those by hand in a little notebook. And having them as that kind of physical, tangible thing, I think is really exciting and really fun and nice to look at. And it's really something I'm quite excited to see and proud to have in my gaming collection. A book of clocks that I'm filling in and only makes sense to me. It's exciting and fun.
So another reason why I think Blades in the Dark works quite well as a solo experience is a really really small mechanic that would be very easy to overlook, and we've been talking for a while and almost have overlooked it. But the engagement roll before your
Mm.
score is such a nice way to jump you into the action without having a GM provide you the exposition. Like you said, Scruffy, without having a GM say, well, this is exactly what's happening. The engagement role is, put simply, once you've chosen to take on the score, you'll then roll dice, and the game will stipulate how many based on a number of factors. And depending on how well you've rolled, the game will say whether you start in a controlled, risky, or desperate situation. And I started my first score for the solo game in a desperate situation. And I thought, okay, well, this is where I'm going. This is what the score's about. What would a desperate start to this look like? And all of a sudden, I'm already away and playing and doing the main action of the game without having a GM say, okay, we're going to time skip now. We're going to go to this other place. I don't need to do that because the game has already accounted for that in this neat little role, which I thought was really lovely. It's a nice part of the multiplayer game, but it works just as well solo. And I think even kind of is more important in the solo game, in my opinion. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the best things for getting you into the action and fast. Because I have a tendency to overworld build and overplan when I play solo, especially in games like Ironsworn, where you can just sit there for ages and build up every little detail of the place you're in if you want to, and I do. But in Blades, it says don't overplan. Just come up with a score, maybe come up with some key characters or contacts and a bit of exposition about what you're doing. And you can, incidentally, roll for all this. It's all in the base book. You can roll for different scores, and it will give you a generation of a score that suits your gang, something they're likely to be hired to do or want to work to do if you had no ideas. But I mean, you do end up with a few story threads that you end up following, I find. And this engagement role does a lot of the heavy lifting there. It just says, okay, so you're going up to wherever to do whatever. Here's your position in that location and in that approach. And then you have to just start from there, and you start in the middle of the action.
It feels very full throttle, and it's wonderful that you can do that without having. So in most games, that sort of engagement role would be, like you said, Scruffy, a bit of exposition from the GM. It would be, okay, this is where you are now. Cut a day, and imagine you're in a. No, you don't need to do that. It is you're on your way. You're about to start your score. Do you start in a controlled, a risky, or desperate situation? Roll. You find out. Okay, what would a controlled position look like here? Right. Well, that's where I am then, and you don't have to worry about all that kind of how did I get here? What am I, that information doesn't need to come from anyone else. It's already coming from the game, which I think is just lovely.
Yeah, there's a similar mechanic in the mythic system. So in this is the thing I took from mainly from the mythic system. You, based on your chaos rank, which starts at 5 and then goes up if you had a bad scene, goes down if you had a good scene, like if you were in control in the scene, you will then roll a d10 dice to see if your scene goes ahead as planned. And if you roll under the chaos level or equal to, then the scene is either interrupted or altered in some way. And that's an interesting choice for how to bring some conflict into the scene and make it a bit different. And when I'm saying scene here, I define scenes in my game as just any sort of change in action, a move to a new location, attempting an ultimately different goal to the one I was just attempting to achieve. So I brought that in with the mythic system beyond the engagement role, and it kind of felt like a mini engagement role from then on. And those weren't always bad conflicts. Sometimes they were opportunities in the mythic system, but sometimes they were hindrances, especially interrupted scenes. One point we got ambushed, which has sparked a whole separate score for me in my game during a score. And I really like that. I really like having those sort of moments of interruption and turbulence that might or might not happen. And I think the engagement role is a great example of that. Right from the start, it gives you that kind of initial jumping off point, just in a quick dice roll. It's lovely.
It is lovely, and like I said, I think it especially suits itself to solo.
There is just one more thing to bring up there on that point of the engagement role, and it's speeding you into the action, and that is the flashbacks. So
Yes.
this is really important, I think, because by saying you get to skip setup, it might upset some people as a kind of, but how do I prepare for things to happen? And the way you do it in Blaze is you react to things as they happen. And you say, well, I think my character will have prepared for this contingency. They will, you're running away and you'll be like, aha, I know where I'm running. I'm running to a place I have set up already and I have it rigged with a trap. And if you decide to make that flashback happen and say that you did this, you set up a place, you rigged it with traps, you take a number of stress equal to how complicated you think that flashback would have been to do. It was a stressful thing for your character to do, and then it just is. It is. So now you're running to a place you've got rigged full of booby traps or whatever it is. That you can have planted a weapon or a disguise or a person in a place and have it all play out in the game. It's really nice way to come up with complicated plans on the fly and see them happen and resolve, but at the cost of stress. So it's something that you kind of start off having the resources to do at the start of your score. But as the score goes on, as your stress ticks up and ticks up, you suddenly can't pull these ex machinas out of your hat when you're having to just resolve it, which creates and forces a resolution to the scene, I think.
And again, it encourages. It gives you license to make things up. It's like it's okay to bring this thing into the game. It's okay to make this up because my character's taking stress for it, and gives you a license, which is very important when playing solo.
And the same thing happens with gear, that you don't plan your characters, every item they're carrying. You don't take your 30 foot of hemp rope and that weighs 10 pounds in an intricate gear system. No, you just decide at the start of the score, I'm going to be traveling light, heavy, or normal, medium. And that gives you a certain number of ticks to have for items or armor that you just tick off when you need them. Oh, I need a weapon right now. Good job I brought my weapon. I tick a load and I've got that weapon. But you're limited to obviously how much you're carrying in that kind of abstract way.
Which is very nice. It's very nice, and again, it gives you license. It says, it's okay to now have a weapon because you said before you left you were carrying 5 things. So of course it's okay. That was one of your 5 things. Don't worry about it. It's very cinematic, is the word I would use.
Yes.
It's cinema, especially the flashbacks. It's cinematic for 2 reasons. One is that obviously it dumps you straight into the action and allows you to make things up on the fly and gives you license to do so, which feels cinematic. But also, because you have to take stress to do it, and because you have to take stress in order to roll extra dice, and you do need to roll extra dice in order to pretty much succeed at anything in this game.
Well, I mean, you have a 50-50 chance of succeeding with one dice.
You have a 50-50 chance of succeeding with a complication. So the game is always encouraging you to take more stress, to push yourself, to overstretch, like you said at the start of the game, Scruffy. And this means that by the end of every score, I always feel like I'm just getting out by the skin of my teeth,
Yeah.
I've just ran away from the burning building and it's cinematically exploded behind me as my character falls heroically to the floor with their shirt off,
Covered in wounds and stressed to the point of breaking.
Yes. And that's really fun. It makes every session very exciting. It feels very kind of the fact that it works in this whole sort of system where there's the free play, then there's the score, and then there's a downtime. It feels very Monster of the Weeky. It feels very much like it's not just one that there will be a long overarching flowing story, but also there doesn't have to be. And all of those scores always end in a way that is exciting. I find it's a very exciting game, and full throttle is the word I used earlier when I spoke about the engagement role, and I think that's a really good way to describe this game. It's not because it's all action, because it's like Scruffy, like you said, it's not a combat game. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. It's a story game. That story is full throttle, and it will be exciting for sure.
Yes. Okay. I want to move on quickly here to NPCs, if that's okay with you, Norm, and how that works in a solo game, because that's the other thing that I think GMs are often responsible for is NPCs, right? It's other characters. And Blaze is particularly interesting for this one as a case study because you have a gang. When you set up your crew, you may have cohorts, and they represent the other people in your gang. So they'll have different sort of abilities. Your cohorts might be thugs, or I've forgotten the other types, but sneaks or whatever. They have a thing they're good at. Rovers, they're good at driving and stuff, and that's kind of a catch-all for your other players. So you're not just wandering around as a solo Ironlander here. You have your buddies at your back, right? How did you get on with that?
Yeah, if I'm honest, this was one of the parts that I found the most challenging.
Hmm.
I found it really challenging when it was myself. I almost had to keep reminding myself that I have other people with me. And actually,
Yeah.
in my latest score, I moved out, I moved out with four people, and I was realizing that I was having a lot of ease having conversations with one NPC, but the other two not so much. So I actually made it happen so that they were stuck in one of the carriages that I moved away from. So I'm no longer with them because I just couldn't even be bothered to do it anymore. So
Right.
this is one area where I found it particularly challenging, and I'd be really interested to know what you thought because, well, one, I want the tips, and two, it'd be comforting to know if you had the same issues I did.
Yeah, so I was really hoping that this would be where the Alone in the Dark thing kind of won through. And to some extent it did, but the Alone in the Dark supplement really doesn't offer a huge amount besides one major selling point for me, which is the oracles. And so it has these pictures, just tons and tons of pictures. And what you do is you roll 3d6 that gives you a picture, and then you do it again. And those pictures can be used for basically anything, but especially they're useful, I think, for characters and important NPCs and helping kind of work out something about them. So you might get a picture of a skull with a crown on it and a vulture. And from that, you've got this kind of vivid image to draw on. And somehow it always just works for me in allowing me to make up a lot about that character, who they are, what they think. And then obviously I'll roll on the NPC oracles from the main book for, maybe their gender, maybe their physical appearance, their goals, all those sort of fun things. It doesn't take very long to have a hugely interesting character there.
How great is it that this stuff exists in the main rulebook anyway, and it's not a solo game?
Yeah, the main rulebook you can get away with just fine. You don't need those pictures. That's just an additional thing. And besides those pictures, the Alone in the Dark book doesn't really give you anything else. It gives you a little rule for just if you want to have encounters with not important NPCs, how to quickly come up with that. And it boils down to just a fortune roll, right? You could use the same mechanics from the main rulebook. You just roll a fortune roll to see how hostile they are towards you at that moment. It doesn't give you any sort of generative tools for dialogue, which I always find the hardest thing to come up with in a solo RPG. Dialogue, it's really difficult. I end up making my own homebrew system, which I won't bore you with here. But yeah, I think that was the one bit I found really difficult. And I think for me, it was just about letting myself treat these groups of people, groups as NPCs, groups of cohorts as just a generic group, and only drawing out specific individuals when I encountered them specifically myself. That was the sort of main point. And then naming them when I got to know them more and giving them goals when I got to know them more. And it kind of felt more real that way and more like I was learning about them as my character was learning about them.
Yeah, I think the way I handled it myself is I made myself the gang leader. So
Yes,
when I
me too.
didn't know these people very well, it was because, well, they're below me. There were people that I could boss around. They're lackeys. They're
Hmm.
not my best friends, and that kind of helped abstract things a little bit. But that's kind of weak. That is pretty weak.
But I feel like the more I play, the more I'm getting to know every single member of my gang. I only have kind of one slot left. What I do is when something important happens and I don't know, I make my gang do a roll, and then a complication happens. I often roll to say, okay, well, who has the complication? Maybe one of them gets knocked out. Who is it? Oh, it's Cobb. And then I know, I'm specifically able to name them. I've almost got everyone set in my head. And actually, I've been trying to experiment with one thing which I've had kind of mixed feelings about, and that is I've tried to make one of the characters specifically my second in command and given them a name and actually made a whole character sheet for them. And I'm almost trying to play multi-handed now with another character, which is interesting.
Yeah, I've actually done something similar, but not with the multi-handing aspect. I have a second in command who who comes with me in most places I go. Her name is Mercy. I kind of did the same thing. I didn't make a character sheet for her, but I will sometimes imagine that she's assisting me. And this is kind of where I'm house ruling a little bit. If I'm doing something and Mercy is there, I might give myself a free bonus die for like an assistance role, because why not?
Yeah.
That's supposed to happen in multiplayer. Why can't it happen when I have Mercy with me? She's my second in command, and that's been quite helpful. And I'm finding dialogue with her quite easy because I think she's such a funny character. I'm finding dialogue a lot easier with NPCs I encounter outside of my crew. I think
Interesting.
I just find the idea of having a whole crew full of people who aren't being played a little bit overwhelming sometimes.
Hmm.
But I think you can kind of choose to interact with that aspect of it as much or as little as you want to, which is the reason it wasn't too intrusive and the reason I'm not being harsh on the system for it.
Yeah, I think also it's not like you've got a massive army. You've got like five or
Mm,
six guys. Maybe
yeah.
even less. You could say I've given myself like six guys, and one of them, like I say, I've made into an actual character now. So when they assist me, they take stress. There's going to be consequences for it. When they get hurt, they get hurt. I am finding that it's taking a bit of attention away from the immersion for getting into my character. That's the only downside I'd say to doing that specific system. But on the flip side, I really like the character that I've added in there. So it's an interesting one. It's a way I've never thought of playing before. Maybe I'll do it, keep it going. Maybe I won't. I haven't had a huge amount of experience with that yet, but it's a fun thing to try.
Okay, so we've kind of said what we enjoyed about this game that and converts well to the solo experience. The dice rolling, the fact that it's player facing, the fact that it's got the engagement role in there. All these things make for good solo experience. But now we're starting to touch on the NPCs and how that is kind of a difficult thing
Mm.
to recreate on the solo game. How it's difficult to recreate the crew. Are there any other areas where you felt that this game, where you've ran into a wall and you thought, actually, I either need to create something outside of the game myself, like what we briefly touched on, or actually this part of the game isn't working quite well for solo? Is there any other areas where you ran into those issues?
Yes, and this was actually the specific impetus for making me want to make one of my NPCs into a real character. And that is that in Blades, during downtime, you have two actions and you can pay coins for an additional action. And certain things require more of an action investment than that allotted amount, I think. And I think it's geared towards assuming that you'll be with a crew of multiple players. So you'll have a pool of maybe six or even more actions collectively. So somebody can waste one of those actions for the team and hire an asset, for example, that you need, a doctor to heal you, and then the rest of you can take advantage of that asset that's been hired for the group. Now, obviously, playing solo, you're limited to just two actions, which is kind of a wild oversight and a bit surprising that it wasn't mentioned in either the rule book, which does account for some things. For example, it says you can take a few more pips for your character to give them a bit more all-round skill to make up for not having as many players, or the Alone in the Dark solo supplement didn't mention it either, which blows my mind because I don't know how you can have played downtime with one player and not realized you need more actions to get anywhere in your downtime. I mean, obviously, one thing I do like about Blades is that it should feel like you never have quite enough, like you're never able to heal up 100% comfortably during downtime. It's nice that you've got some lingering stress or some lingering wounds, right? But it didn't feel like I even had the chance like to do basically anything during downtime. Like I don't know how you'd ever have more time to do anything other than just visit your stress healer and visit your health healer if you've got one. And if you haven't, I don't know what you can do.
No, I agree. And another part about downtime I thought was a bit wonky solo was the leveling up. The
Mm,
way you gain XP in the game, you've already alluded to one way you can gain XP, which is to take desperate actions. The other way you do it is very typical for Powered by the Apocalypse game, which is in multiplayer, you will go around the table and you will get points to level up every time you role played your character in a certain way. So it kind of rewards you for good role playing. If you've made your character make decisions based on their background, their heritage, or even if you've done something that was negative for your character, but because it would be in line with what they would have likely done in the situation. That's really fun to do around a table. You know, it's really fun to go, oh yeah, Scruffy, when you did that thing earlier, that was so your character. You definitely deserve an experience point for that. That's kind of like a little light-hearted bit of almost, well, downtime's the right word for it, you know. It's like a debrief after the actual main role-playing session. Doing that solo is self-congratulatory and boring.
And somewhat depressing, I found when I realized I looked at my character sheet at the end of one session and I saw the you expressed your beliefs, drives, heritage, or background. And I realized I didn't give myself any opportunity to do that. And maybe that's something I should work on, but it kind of just didn't come up. Like if I was talking to another
Mhm.
player, it might come up. You know, it's more likely you can be like, oh, well, if you've been in the city as long as I have, la, 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 you know, and you can talk about it with someone. But it's very difficult to find situations to have dialogue with NPCs that isn't to do directly with the current conflict.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very much more focused experience, which I find solo role playing often is. In fact, I think some of the best stories I've made role playing are from my solo role playing games. But all the fun for multiplayer is those kind of little bit of banter moments where you have that kind of in character conversation that isn't relevant to the story. That's not going to happen in solo play. It's a different game, and I think that's what in our episode about Scarlet Heroes, Deborah said solo role playing won't be and shouldn't try to emulate multiplayer role playing. And part of me thought when she said that, and I didn't challenge it at all, but part of me thought, why not?
Mm,
Why not? Why can't it be? But now that I'm running into these things and experiencing Blades in the Dark, which is a multiplayer game, and I played it multiplayer first, and I'm seeing the difference, I understand what she means now. I get it.
yeah. Yeah, I think a big part of it boils down to the dialogue doesn't really often go tangential. It doesn't go to sort of weird places, and that's one thing that I've been trying to house rule for myself, and I'm having a bit more success with my little system. And I think it's really important because, like, when you're playing by yourself, it feels like conversations really do stay on topic and go to the point. You say to them, drop your weapon or I'll do this, and then they either do it or don't, and that's that's the conversation. They don't tell you a story about their past, which is a shame. And I really think it's something that I haven't found a system for to account for yet, which is why I'm trying to tinker with one myself.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think it's something that's fundamental to a lot of solo role playing from my experience. However, it's almost like Blaze is highlighting it to itself because it's not supposed to be a solo experience. And when you do that, like you said, it
Mm.
is it is a little bit depressing. It's a bit like, oh yeah, I didn't do that. Oh, okay, because I, like you said, Scruffy, I didn't have the opportunity. But actually, what you did have is a really really fun time, and you shouldn't feel bad about it. You know?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I think it is something that is missing from the system. I think it's something that just we need to discover a solution for, because it's not something that we've found in our sort of initial encounter here. But maybe we will find something better later. And I think my system's got some legs. So.
Nice. I think it's almost unfair to be like, oh, and Blades in the Dark doesn't do this very well. It's not supposed to.
No, no.
It's a multiplayer game, you know. But it is interesting how well it did lend itself to solo in a lot of ways, and I did have a lot of fun with it. And
Mm,
it sounds like you did as well, Scruffy.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot more to talk about it with it as well. Like, especially the real pull to come back and stuff is I think the gang advancement, that you'll set your gang up, you'll give them maybe a goal or an agenda, a type of way of doing things, a current reputation, and then as you play, you build up this turf around the city. You choose your initial hunting grounds, and then you kind of expand out. And yeah, I think it's got a real good pull factor to kind of keep you hooked and keep you drawn in. And you've got a tier. You start out at a level 0 gang, and you're trying to get enough reputation to become a level 1 gang, attract more people, and that'll be more NPCs to try and work out what the hell to do with in solo play.
But it does. But those criticisms aside, it is something that I had a lot of fun with, and
Hmm.
yeah, I did enjoy it a lot. There was one more point that you brought up with me earlier, Scruffy. Let's unpack that.
Okay, so I'd love to talk about this because I think it's true for any solo RP, whether it's an established solo RP or not. And that is just getting started with it and committing to doing it and sitting down and going through it all, and how difficult that is, how psychologically challenging it is to just get started with something like this. Even with all the will in the world, you sit there and you think, this would be awesome. I really want to play X solo, or but then you put it off and you procrastinate it, and it seems like an insurmountable task to do. And I just want to kind of shine a light on that here. I don't really necessarily have any answers to it. I'm not gonna be able to give you a here's how you stop doing that. But I want to kind of talk about this because it's something that I think can feel like only you feel.
Yeah, I think if we compare it to board games, for example, with a board game, it has an estimated time on it. It's going to take you 60 to 90 minutes, so you know how long it's going to take. It has a rulebook which is a lot smaller than a role-playing rulebook. It has tutorial videos which tell you the correct way to play. You can make your own decisions in it, but this is the way you play the game. With role-playing, it's a lot more nuanced than that. And, you can play for as long as you want. You can change things as much as you want. You can house rule it. You can pull things from other role-playing games. You can set it in a different universe. You can... And I feel like there's no wrong way.
There's no wrong answers, but that means there's no right answers.
Yes, indeed. So the idea of kind of, where do I begin then? Where do I start? And I knew what I was going to do with Blades is make a crew first, and then make a character, and then start a score. But the idea of doing all three of those things just felt like such a big task. It felt like such a big commitment. Of course, when you do it, it's done, and you think, I don't know what all the fuss was about, but I'm glad that I'm not the only one who experienced that.
Yeah.
I had the same thing when we learnt Iron Swan, and I had the same thing when we learnt Scarlet Heroes as well. I didn't so much with the Wretched because of the type of game it is.
Yeah, it's more like a board game, isn't it? It has a clear rule book with a structure that you just follow.
You follow the procedure, and then it has an end. It has a clear end, and yeah, so I didn't have that issue there. So I think I'm glad that you experienced it, not, and it wasn't just me and my depression that was causing me to procrastinate. But yeah, I also don't have the answer to that, Scruffy. I don't know
Yeah,
what
I
I
mean,
can say.
I remember when I was a teenager, and the first time I was sort of dabbling in RP, I was playing a character in a Dungeons and Dragons game, and I was making my character and coming up with all the stats and spells. And one of my friends, because I was doing it at school when I should have been studying or whatever, one of my friends said, what is that? It looks like you're filling in tax forms or whatever. And just they were agog that I was doing so much work for fun. And I think that's what it can kind of feel like, isn't it? When you're setting up to play something like this, that it's a lot of investment for an uncertain payoff. And it's a lot easier to trust a board game or a RP system like the Wretched that has a kind of, it seems to have an agenda and seems to say, don't worry, it's all set up for you to have fun. Whereas if you're setting up something for yourself, whether that be an actually established solar system or even harder, taking a system and trying to hodgepodge it into something new and that works, it can feel like, I don't know if this is even ever going to pay off. And that's quite scary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a little bit. It is a little bit, and I'll be honest. Sometimes I thought, before, when I was thinking of starting, I was like, I could, instead of doing this, I could just play Iron Swan. I do know the rules already. I do know it works solo. I could just do that instead. And I'm glad that I didn't, because I had obviously a lovely experience with Blades in the Dark solo, and I think I think a lot of it lent itself really well. But getting over that initial hump is a real thing, and I think a lot of solo players will experience it. And even if you compare playing a multiplayer board game compared to playing a solo board game, sometimes it's difficult to pull a solo game off the shelf. If I was feeling really exhausted after a long day at work, the chances of me pulling a solo game off the shelf are exponentially smaller than chances of me pulling a game off the shelf if you came round and said, "Hey Norm, I got a free hour. Do you want to play a game?" I'd be like, "Oh, yes, I do, Scruffy."
That's because you'll have fun with Scruffy.
And I think it's just a solo gaming thing. I think it's just a thing we all experience. And,
I think you're right. I think it's just it just felt like another level with this. It was It's very
Yeah.
challenging. And I'm like you with you, Norm. I'm really glad that I actually stuck with it and committed to it because I feel like the fun I had was unexpected. I didn't expect to have as much fun as I had, and that I want to carry on and play this more. I didn't think anything would beat Ironsworn for me or Starforge in terms of solo RP experiences. Like all the time I was setting up, and so I was like, I'm going to do this for the show, and then I'm going to go back to Ironsworn. No, I'm going to be playing this. And they're different experiences, so not instead, but alongside. But beyond that, even just in terms of the tools I think that I've developed for myself as a player, as a solo RP player, and even if I were to go and do GMing or even being a player in a game, I feel like I'm a lot more experienced just from trying to really make it work for myself. It's really good.
Yes. I feel like you learn your preferences a lot when you solo RP. And I said that during the Scarlet Heroes
Mm.
episode, and I'm saying it again here because it's true. It's true. I understand much more what I think is good GMing, what is, what gives players agency and what doesn't, and how to invent things in the game in reaction to player agency rather than in spite of it.
Oh yeah, exactly.
And that's something that solo RPing will definitely teach you, and even more so when you're converting or chopping down a big multiplayer system like this. But if you're interested in playing Blades in the Dark, like I said, it works very well solo. If you're not though interested in playing it solo, still check it out for multiplayer because it's a fantastic multiplayer game as well. And if you picked up the Black Lives Matter bundle last year, or I think it's actually called the Bundle for Racial Justice and Equality. You already own this game if you're a part of that bundle, and there were millions of people on there. So there's a chance that there's somebody listening to this who doesn't know they have it and now does know that they already own the game. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and any questions about sort of trying to convert a system into solo RP or trying to play Blades in the Dark for the first time, then do hop onto our Discord and feel free to me because I am really happy to share my experience.
So let's move on to the next part of the show. So what we've got coming up now is, as you long-time listeners will know, we've asked a question last episode. We've got the answers from you listeners, and we're going to respond to those now. But before we do, Scruffy, what is the question for today's episode?
So the question for this episode is, what is a game that you've put off learning or playing, or are still putting off learning or playing, but when you did play it, if you did play it, what was the reaction to it?
Yeah, was it as difficult to learn as you thought? Was the or was the challenge worth it? Was it not worth it? Was it even a challenge in the first place? Did you not know what all the fuss was about by the time you got
Yeah.
around to it?
Had you built it up as a big, exciting experience only to be disappointed, or were you just sick of it by that point and were pleasantly surprised when you got around to playing it?
Yeah, we'd love to know because, like I said, sometimes with these solo RPGs, it can feel like a lot to set all the wheels in motion. But I don't know about you, Scruffy. But it feels like to set up a solo RPG, you got to push a boulder up a hill. But when you get it up the hill, it's just going to roll the way down the other side, and yeah, and the momentum carries itself through.
And the view is worth it. And it's worth mentioning this doesn't have to be a solo game. If there's a board game that you put off learning because it was a bit of a beast or whatever, or even just for no reason, I'd love to hear about that too.
Yeah, 'cause you can certainly get into weird habits like that. I've got a few of those I could talk about, but this isn't called Norm's questions; it's called listener questions. So, be interested to hear what you guys have to say. Okay, then.
Yes.
So let's have a look at the responses we got from the last episode.
So the question from the last episode was, what is a game that you enjoyed losing at, which gives you that I gotta try again feeling? And the first response we had was from Kent Changa. Sorry if I've got that wrong. They said, the first time I lost StarCraft, the board game, I was confused since I had a lot of fun. Then I realized I had fun because I could tell what I did wrong and how to correct it. After that, my tastes changed to like low luck, high depth games. There are some guilty pleasures I have, but they're just for casual fun. So, to answer the question, I enjoy losing all my favorite games. Nice catch all there.
It's kind of interesting. I've actually said it before a couple of times that I sometimes, if I've played a game for the first time and I beat people who are experienced at the game, sometimes I think, maybe this game isn't that good. you know? sometimes actually losing at a game can make me think, yes, there's more to this game that I haven't experienced yet. I don't understand the decision space yet because it's deeper than I thought it was, and that makes me excited to come back. Whereas sometimes a victory will make me feel like, okay, I think I figured this game out, and that might be wrong. Sometimes you just luck into something, or sometimes more experienced players block themselves out where you sneak off into a lead that was unexpected. But I've genuinely had it before where I've won a game and it's kind of put me off because I thought maybe the decision space is a little bit more shallow than what I want to come back for. Does that make sense, Scruffy?
It does make sense. And in the Discord, uh, Kent Changa went on to respond to Kendall, who responded about talking about a debrief after the games and how that can be really helpful. And Kent Changa said that it's way better when you discuss it with other players, that they enjoy losing because they knew it was their fault and that they could improve and fix their mistakes. And I think that that really does help if you have other people to talk to about the game, and people can help you, guide you with where and what went wrong and why you went wrong, and give you sort of tactical advice. Bringing in other players is really, really helpful there.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, what the term mistake means as well, because to me, mistake implies that it's something you've done wrong and you can change it next time. But often with these kind of, especially multiplayer games, the kind of deeply interactive games that I enjoy multiplayer, like 18xx, a lot of them aren't. If I think, okay, I know where the game went wrong, it's not like you can go, okay, I just won't do that next time, because the games are so interactive that if I do something different, everybody else around the table will do something different as well, which I
Hmm.
find really, really interesting. I like how games get in your head like that, where you think, okay, I know what I've done wrong, but I can't just not do that next time and expect a different result. I actually have to to plan and do something different and learn and just have a broader depth of knowledge about this game system and how to win, rather than just, okay, I know what my mistake was. I won't do that next time, and then I'll be much more successful. I'd much prefer those kind of games where you go, okay, I think I know what I did wrong, but I still don't know everything to do right next time. It depends on what everyone else is going to do. Of course, in solo, that's completely irrelevant. So maybe I shouldn't have said any of that. But
No, I'm really with you there, and I think it applies to solo too. That I think for me, I'm kind of maybe even the opposite to Kent Changa there, in that I prefer losing at games where it was not 100% obvious why I lost and that there's not an optimum strategy. I don't really enjoy the puzzle of working out the optimum strategy for games solo, which is why I don't like things like Caverna and Roads and Boats solo, because it is a very much a puzzly game in a meta sense of trying to work out the best route that is deterministic every time. And I much prefer the opportunistic play style and trying to react to situations as they occur and puzzle out the best looking solution in the moment. And if I lose a game that's much more chaotic or opportunistic like that, that feels like it has sort of life and push back, I kind of feel incentivized to try maybe a different strategy or try it with a different game state that will inevitably emerge from the game. So
yes, and
yeah,
often you'll know why you lost, but not exactly how to rectify that until you play
yeah,
again.
yeah. Or if your play style would have worked in a different context, but you missed a key important thing that was happening that meant it wouldn't work.
It's interesting.
That is interesting.
The next one we had was from Stop Somewhere Eric, who says, a couple of thoughts on games that I've enjoyed losing. For solo play, Friday, when I lose to this little gem, which I've yet to win, I feel like I'm still learning something from the experience of playing, and it fits the survivalist theme of scraping by when you eventually fall into madness or death. I imagine Robinson Crusoe might work similar when you're defeated by a nasty storm. Yeah, I can confirm that's exactly how it feels. Spirit Island worked similarly for me. I had more fun when I was being threatened to be pushed off the map than when I actually wiped out the colonists and didn't even realise for sure that I had won.
Yeah, yeah.
I think games with win conditions like these, that are not based on a scoring system, are more fun to lose. When I lose in a points based game, it makes me just want to play again and do better next time, but doesn't make me feel like a flat out loss so much as just trying to do a little bit better next time. I think the reason viticulture isn't nearly as fun to lose is that there is a set goal to reach, and not reaching it after all the work you'd put into your game feels unfulfilling. And a side point, losing, and they put this in quotation marks, role playing games like dying or going mad in, say, Iron Sworn or Thousand-Year-Old Vampire, doesn't feel like losses so much as completed storylines. Same could be said for a legacy game or games like Oath, where if you lose in the game in that round, it affects future rounds with yourself or even other players. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting distinction there about the point-based thing. I'm surprised because that, to me, they're the same thing. Having a target number of points you need, or a target score to get to be. But I suppose it's the granularity of, you succeed an average success, or you are a mastermind at the game. Is that what they're getting at there with the versus just not reaching a certain number in viticulture, meaning you lose? Is that the?
Yeah, but I think even with games like Viticulture or Feast for Odin or Caverna, where you just have a set number, you just get this set number or not. Even though you could describe that as a win or loss condition, it still feels different because you get to play the whole game. You play the whole game through and you
Mhm.
count your score. And you'd do the same thing if you won. You'd play the whole thing through and you count the score, but you'd either win or lose. If you lose at Mage Knight, you wouldn't have taken the final city. You wouldn't have done that thing that meant you won. You've not. The game has been different because you've lost and haven't fulfilled your objective. You don't just get to finish the way you normally finish and count your score. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I think I agree with that. I don't know if that's exactly what Stop Somewhere is saying there,
No.
but yeah, that's an interesting point as well. That changing game state and the way the thing that you play being slightly different depending on if you succeed or fail. That's yeah, hadn't really thought of that. That's really interesting.
I think it's more. This feels more impactful, doesn't it? Like I didn't
Mm,
manage to get to the final city. I failed. Whereas in Feast Road, and you go, well, I played through all 7 rounds. Whether you won or lost, you played all 7 rounds. You placed the same amount of workers.
yeah.
You just, I don't know, maybe you were 1 point too low, 1 point too high, and it almost feels inconsequential, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more about the losing an RPG, dying or going mad, say in Ironsworn, being being not an end to the story, but not bad. Not my best experience from Ironsworn, I think, has been my first character dying in it, and that being a complete story. Then it does feel quite fulfilling, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I think, yeah, I've never even attached the word win or lose to an RPG before because it is just a way of exploring a story or exploring a character. And sometimes that involves, not nice things, and sometimes it involves nice things.
Mm.
I never attribute it to winning or losing, but when you put it like that, yeah, there's a reason why it feels okay to die in an RPG, but maybe not so much in Seventh Continent, for example.
Cool. And the last comment we had was from Rumple Frumpkins, who says, I really enjoyed losing on almost every playthrough of Todd Sanders' Maiden in the Forest. It's a fantastic little puzzly game, free print and play, where you have only yourself to blame for losing. It makes you say to yourself, I should have seen that coming. Why didn't I see that coming? Okay, this time I'm going to get it. Additionally, I agree 100% about losing in RPGs. It's not really losing, but it's so much fun when your character is on the ropes and everything is going wrong.
It's almost more fun.
Yeah, almost.
I mean, that's the whole
I
premise
think,
about Blades in the Dark.
yeah, I think it's interesting. Well, Blaze in the Dark Death isn't necessarily the end, but I think it's really interesting how difficult it is to close a story in any way other than death for your character. And I kind of feel like a lot more solo RPGs need to have a kind of end thing for you to be striving towards. But maybe that's just me. I think a lot of them want to play open ended and let you play the campaign forever and ever and ever and ever, and ever, and you set your own end if you want. But I'd like to see more systems give you a life goal, an epilogue.
Yeah, well, like Scarlet Heroes, where there's a clear end to the urban adventures, for example.
Yes, yes, but then again, that's still not the end of your story. But yeah, those are great. That's exactly the right sort of thing, for sure.
because it always prompts you to, okay, do you want to stop now or keep going?
I suppose with Blade, you do get that in that every score is
It's self-contained.
self-contained story, like you said, and I think that there is something to be said for that sort of episodic nature to RPing. Maybe that's my preference. Eh?
Yeah, maybe it's interesting. Yeah, I don't know which one I would prefer. I thought I'd spend more time talking about the episodic nature of Blades during this episode, but we are alas out of time, so yeah, I won't do so. But yeah, those were all the responses we got from last episode. So thank you very much to everyone who responded. Also, thank you so much to Dan, who co-hosted the last episode in my absence. I really, really appreciate the work you did. The episode sounded great, so massively appreciate it. Thank you very much.
And for anyone who wants to hear Norm's opinions on Seventh Continent said verbatim, check out our Patreon page where we have the planning phase. In the last episode, Norm revealed all.
It's very clickbaity of you, Scruffy. You won't believe what Norm said about Seventh Continent.
It will blow your mind. 5 reasons why.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so we do have another show called The Planning Phase, if you don't know. Planning Phase is where we talk about what's upcoming on the show. We discuss on air what we should cover. So this episode, for example, came out of the idea that, we had together about, how cool would it be to try and explore a multiplayer RPG solo and put to test what we've learned and discuss that on air. And you can hear us make those decisions on The Planning Phase, which is a fun listen, and a sort of 30-minute episodes. And yeah, any pledge amount to our Patreon would give you access to there. So just click on the links there in the description, or if you don't want to do that, it's patreon.com/alwaysplayer1 podcast.
Yeah, we also have polls on there occasionally to let you guys help us make up our minds when we're stuck between several choices. And again, any pledge, you can vote on the polls.
Yes, and next episode, well, not next episode, the one after, episode 32, is going to be about Cloudspire. Cloudspire was voted for by our patrons, so you get to help us pick awesome games as well. Anyway, enough of that.
So I'll just give you guys the question again for this episode. And the question was, what is a game you have put off learning or playing? And if you did play it eventually, how was it?
Okay, excellent. Yes, and if you'd like to write in, you can do so a number of ways. You can email us. It's alwaysplayer1podcast@gmail.com. You can also write on our Discord. You can join the Discord for free. You just have to click the invite in the description. You can also reach out on Facebook and on Instagram. It's at alwaysplayer1podcast on Instagram, and the links to our Facebook are in the description. We also hang out on Reddit. It's always_player_1. And if you'd like to support the show but don't want to sign up to the Patreon, you can also buy us a cup of coffee. It's coffee, which is ko-fi.com/alwaysplayer1. Again, the links to that are in the description. More importantly, though, the best way you can support us is just by listening the way you've done and talking about us. So thank you for listening. We appreciate it endlessly. And if you want to make sure that we keep going, then why not tell other people to listen to us as well? It goes a long way.
Yeah, and thank you everyone to all the shout outs on social media for everyone who has. And yeah, you guys are awesome. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.
Yeah, catch you guys in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the show, don't forget to check out our Patreon page. The links to that are in the description. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Always Player One. Until then, reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or by email to keep the conversation going.